So I have 20 minutes. Fasten your seatbelts. We're going to be going quickly. Let's celebrate the success. Public engagement was not only part of our original plan, it was a central pillar. Let me show you what I mean by that. If you look at our original application, in objective number 1, embedded was public awareness. If you look at all the things that we said we'd do, which come up in red now, it extended from social media, science festivals, involving COPD patients, becoming STEM ambassadors, and various school engagement events, including competitions. All of those we have achieved successfully over the 5-year period. Why is it so important? Well, let me take you to the GOLD statement in 2019. GOLD is the Global Initiative for Chronic Obstructive Lung Disease. These are practitioners the world over, experts, who had a statement in 2019, and within that statement was a list or a table of actions. And look and spot immediately what the top 2 actions on that are. It's increasing public awareness and preventing COPD. Why is that important? Well, if you look at the image, this is a question we ask the pupils in the school. When's the best time to put out a fire? When you light the match or when the entire building's ablaze? And of course, the kids immediately respond, it's the match. So we explain to them that that's why we are talking to them in the schools before the lifetime of a behavior begins that can cause long-term chronic lung disease. We do what we can with people who have established disease, but the best time is to be preventative. Let me also just give you a small insight into the Scottish Respiratory Care Plan. I know Emma knows all about this. I want you to recognise what priority number 1 in that plan is. It's prevention. So the first thing I want you to recognise is this was not just a box for us to tick. This was a central part of the breath programme. To that end, we targeted schools purposely. And we targeted schools across the length and breadth of the regions, Scotland, Ireland, and Northern Ireland. And in so doing, we actually reached out to both primary schools, but also secondary schools, and you'll see why in a moment. Central to that were the PhD students. We actually had in total 19 PhD students linked with this program, and they were the ambassadors to take the public engagement message out to the school children. And there was 4 parts to that. One was to make them aware of COPD, what actually COPD was, and the fact their area was an area of high prevalence. Okay? Second was to build in an anti-smoking message, because smoking is a high risk factor for COPD. Third was to explain the importance of research. Quite often the children would ask, why do we live in an area of high COPD? And the answer is, we don't know. And that's the value of research, trying to understand why COPD is so prevalent in the regions we represent today. And finally, it was an opportunity to talk about universities, because some of the areas we went to were quite remote, nowhere near universities. So it introduced them to and opened their eyes to the opportunities of universities. One of the things I found concerning when I was involved with some of the public engagement was when I talked about COPD and asked if any of the children had heard of COPD, usually there was very few hands, but sometimes a hand would go up and ask, is it anything to do with emphysema? And the fact that the children in these regions know that medical term speaks to the high prevalence of COPD, which involves emphysema, as Keith explained to you, within these specific regions. They have family members who are affected or afflicted by this condition. The students were great. It was an enthusiastic response we had from the students with the pupils, and vice versa. The students benefited by that engagement. The presentations involved actual presentation to the pupils, but also workstations. And just to give you some small insight into what we were doing with them, one aspect, for example, was having them create their own lung model. So you can see it was a lung in a bottle, where they actually were able to show the lung inflating and deflating under negative pressure ventilation. And the kids, their eyes were wide open when that balloon expanded under the negative pressure when you pulled down the blue glove, which was to represent the diaphragm. They were quite taken by that physical demonstration. The second was assessing their own lung function with a peak flow meter. And that proved to be very competitive amongst the children. But also we used this as an opportunity to simulate lung disease. We'd introduce a restrictive air bung inside the mouthpiece. They would blow again. They'd find it's harder to blow in that condition, and they find that their peak value falls as a consequence. So they understood the measurement of lung restriction, lung obstruction. We also have lung models. I'm going to show you those in more detail in a moment, but it was a great opportunity for the kids to handle the models and actually look and discover firsthand the conditions or the features of these diseases. We had one aspect which I thought would be more of a time filler, and that was the word quiz, but in actual fact it proved also highly competitive, because if they got all the words, they got a gold breath pencil. If they got most of the words, a silver pencil, and if they could participate, they got a bronze pencil, and they all wanted the gold pencils. They wouldn't move on until they got all the words. But it allowed us to identify key words linked to COPD with the pupils. Here's an example of one of the lung models we do use. This is a perfectly normal lung model. So they look at that, get familiarized with what their lung normally should look like, and then we give them various disease models, cancer, asthma, for example, but most importantly for us was COPD. And the children with a bit of exploration would soon find that you could see features, sorry, pointing at the right board, you could see features like the tar of the cigarette smoking identified, the alveolar wall breakdown, the emphysema, and the bronchitis of the airway, the narrowing of the airway. They could see it firsthand, visually, with a model they could actually handle. Not only that, I can explain to them at great length the notion of airway resistance and the lumen diameter of the airways, but actually simply holding a model and seeing, for example, the mucus plug that you can see on that right-hand model, you can immediately see the difficulty somebody experiences when they're trying to breathe through something with such a narrowed restriction. They understand that immediately. We were very keen to involve patients in our program right from the beginning in as much or as many aspects as we could. And we started very initially by simply introducing patient-informed art. These were patients, this is Stephanie David, who had COPD, described her experience of an exacerbation to the artist Greg Manchester, who was funded by AstraZeneca, sorry, pointing at the wrong thing, AstraZeneca, and they were trying to capture the experience of what it's like for Stephanie to have an exacerbation. And she described the panic, the fear it caused, because she felt like she was drowning in air. And that was something that the children could quite well understand when you gave them illustrations like that. And they understand the notion of the fear of drowning, so you can imagine how awful that would be when you're in air breathing, you can't put your head above the water, you're actually got a lung condition that's causing the distress. Of course, we had the real McCoy come along to some of our engagement. We had patients link in with us. I'm going to mention two. Martin Charters, I'm going to introduce his video shortly. Martin was a great champion in linking us with the pupils. He actually came along to the schools. When we first did this at Kakubri Academy, I only had 10 minutes set aside for an interview with Martin. I asked, just off the cuff of the moment, are there any questions that the pupils want to ask? And there was a sea of hands. And for the remaining 50 minutes of the assembly, it was simply the pupils asking Martin questions. And he gave a very honest, a very compelling response, which really, I think, struck a chord with the pupils. So it was greatly appreciated, Martin. I'll introduce him shortly. Not only that, we had a patient, so Martin comes from Dumfries and Galloway. We also had a patient, Malcolm McAllister. He was a journalist, now retired, has COPD, and he provided us a journalistic insight into the experience of COPD, and that's on our Breath webpage. I would try and link you to the webpage just now, but it's just a bit too clever for our software, and I might lose the presentation. But can I encourage you to go look at our Breath webpage? We put a lot of time and effort into it, and you'll see both Malcolm and Martin featured there. And certainly you'll see the journalistic piece provided by Malcolm. The entire group, the consortium, was really impressed by the enthusiasm and the energy of the children and their engagement with us. And we wanted to capture and harness that energy. So we actually we put our minds together, working well as a partnership, and we produced a breath challenge. It was a series of activities after we've had the first visit with them that the children could do in the classroom with the teacher and or at home, completing exercises. And some of the exercises, for example, was producing some artwork. And I'm going to show you some examples of some of the art that they produced. It was great. But not only that, to also write a letter to their local MP or even the First Minister in some cases, explaining their concerns about living in an area of high COPD prevalence. If they were successful in doing that, each of the children and also the school were awarded a breath certificate of excellence, essentially, for completing that challenge. And not only that, they became breath partners, breath school partners. And that allowed them certain aspects that I'm going to talk about in a moment, but allowed them to establish a relationship with Breath, the team. On our webpage, there's hundreds of contributions by the pupils. Please have a look at it, because the children put a lot of time and energy into it. But this was a letter that was written, actually this one was written to me, and it had several things embedded within it, some classic quotes. One was, why, if cigarettes are bad for you, are we allowed to sell cigarettes in shops? It's a good question. It's a good question. Others which quite boldly said, after your presentation, I will never smoke. That's what we wanted. That message across and that understanding from the perspective of the children. We had some that went beyond the call of duty. These two children should look familiar to some of us. In actual fact, they produced posters that featured in windows of classrooms and on our social media. And just to show you one example of the artwork, you really couldn't cram more art into that space. And it covers all aspects. You can see, for example, the DNA, showing the genetic link. You can see airplanes, you can see cars and pollution, you can see cigarettes. They've covered all aspects inside their artwork. This is one example. There's many on the webpage. Please do go visit it. I'm delighted to say the first school to be awarded the Breath Challenge was Belmont Primary School in Stranraer. And it was a big event. We went down and we awarded the certificate at their school assembly, and all the kids gave a speech on their contribution to the assembly, and it was just a wonderful event. It was captured by the local newspapers, and this features here in the Stranraer Free Press. So we were delighted at the success and the engagement of the pupils. And then the pandemic hove into sight. And suddenly, going into schools and having kids blow through narrow tubes and pass-round models didn't seem the greatest idea in terms of infection. So what we did as a team, again, we got together, put our thoughts into how we could deal with this, and we converted the entire challenge into a remote challenge. And I'm delighted to say Moffat Academy and Moffat Primary School were one of the first schools to engage and succeed in the remote version of the Breath Challenge. And you can see that by the fact they're all relatively socially distanced and they've got their masks on. And again, they became Breath partners. You're going to see why that's important in just a moment. We blanket targeted areas, and you're going to see why we did that in a moment. We actually found it was harder to get this up and rolling than we thought it would be. And we discovered that the best model was to find a teacher who was the champion of our cause in the high schools, engage with the high schools, and lead that on into the primary feeder schools. And that's exactly what we did. And you can see we effectively blanket engaged this entire peninsula, this being the peninsula that involves or includes Stranraer. If you want some metrics, well, that converts to, in fact, over 50 schools and over 5,000 children reach. On one occasion, in fact, I went and presented at Stranraer Academy to a teacher who was a mother of a child who I then engaged later in the afternoon at Belmont Primary School, and then we went to the college, and it was a niece of the mother who was present. We literally got all members or branches of the family. We blanket engaged the entire area. Why did we do that? Well, let me pick you back to the map Keith showed you. Look, oops, I'm doing what I'm told not to do, I'm wandering. Look at that hotspot area of prevalence. Can you see the strategy of blanket engaging an area with high COPD prevalence, most of the people, occupants of that area, are unaware of that fact. One of the values of establishing partnership with schools is it allows us to be responsive to their needs. So in other words, having established partnership status, one of the schools approached us and said they have an issue with e-cigarettes and vaping, increased use in and around the school. And so we were invited to come in and talk about the facts, the issues relating to e-cigarettes, which are not a safe alternative to cigarette smoking. And we based this mainly around the ELF, the European Lung Foundation fact sheet, which is a very useful fact sheet to refer to. But it also allowed really valuable opportunities to have our open discussion with the pupils. Here's an advert that looks like it's a good advert, doesn't it? It shows you the cigarette stubs being stubbed out. You see the phantom of death emerging above. Stop the habit. Look at the full advert, though. Stop the habit, start the hobby. What's the hobby? E-cigarettes. Who are they targeting? Well, I think they're targeting the young. And so that was an immediate discussion point with the pupils as to who it is behind the industry of e-cigarettes, and often it's a tobacco industry. It was a very useful point to engage discussion and dialogue with the pupils. Of course, we lost other points of engagement, science fairs being an example. This is the all-island civic dialogue, for example, and you can see we have stands, which are our student staff, as it were, or man, which include our models to engage pupils or attendees, but also brochures that allow us to give people something away to go think about. So the fairs were one also very useful aspect, and quite often we targeted these models that we developed for the primary schools to children who came along. So that made obvious sense, and we got good engagement. But not only that, it was a wonderful conduit to link in the parents. Often they didn't know they lived in an area of high COPD prevalence. Some of them didn't even know that COPD was linked to smoking. The one anecdote I've given before is one young lass who came along to the stand and listened to my presentation on COPD with big wide eyes, disappeared, and an hour later or so she came back hand in hand with two adults, and verbatim she repeated my presentation, what a star, to the two adults who were her parents and both who were smokers. Can you see the value of what we're trying to do through the schools, to the parents, and including the teachers, approaching and really engaging the community? Somewhere in that photograph, I got a chuckle, somewhere in that photograph is a young nurse who came to an understanding of what lung disease like COPD meant. And later on, she became an MSP. And I'm delighted to have Emma Harper join us. Emma today will give a presentation. I'll introduce her shortly. I'm kind of doing that now, actually. But really, Emma's been with us from the start. She actually helped us launch the Breath campaign in the south of Scotland, right at the very beginning of the programme. She has engaged us in the cross-party group for lung health, and we've appreciated that. So we've been, Breath is part of that cross-party group. But also, Emma has highlighted the Breath programme on the floor of Scottish Parliaments on at least 3 occasions, as have others. We've had cross-party group support. So I mentioned people like Ross Greer and also Finlay Carson. And the politicians from these regions have really helped us to engage and gain tracking in that area in terms of getting our message out. We've also come along to some of the school visits, and I want to make a slight confession here. The occasion that Finlay joined me at Kilcowan Primary, it turned out to be a bit of a competition between Finlay the farmer, come MP, and John Lockhart the scientist. And guess who won? It was the scientist, but I'm confessing to you now, I put a restrictive bung, in Finlay's mouthpiece. He didn't know that. So Finlay, if you're listening, I apologize now. Yes, I'll do a rematch if you want. We've had a lot of exposure in the local press. That was our intention, both regionally, local, but also the national press. And I'm going to pause at one, for example. Martin Charters, I told you that was a powerful session. Indeed, the local journalists thought that also, and it featured in the local Galloway News. Continuing on, we've had exposure, as I said, all throughout Scotland and Ireland, all across the Northern Ireland, all the regions that I'm showing you where I'm talking about Scotland. This is played out across the 3 partners. We actually got a 2-page article all about breath, COPD, in southwest of Scotland, in the Sunday Post, which is a national paper in Scotland. And not only did our reach extend to the regions of the nation, it actually extended across the European Union by being featured in the SEUPB, the EU e-zine that the funder produces. How am I doing for time? Do I need to accelerate? Yes, okay, getting a bit. So let me I'll be quick then. So we have local immediate impact in the regions that we're talking about. Dundalk, UWS, Paisley, and also Belfast, Queens. But we have even more impact when we come together. And here, for example, on Clean Air Day, we all made a collective statement of our support. That's the value of a program as big as this, in terms of that level of support. Charity funding, the students have gone beyond the call of duty in raising funds. I think they had a notion of throwing a professor off a bridge for charity. We'll leave you to work out which professor they had in mind. Conference impact, we went to many conferences, local, national, international. We could have, on some occasions, real impact by the fact there was 16 presentations, all coming from breath. We went to European Parliament, the Lees, we showcased the breath mission. There's Karina Croatu, the European Commissioner, Maureen McGuinness you'll recognise, the Vice President at that point, and you'll see also local MEPs from Ireland and Northern Ireland, Jim Nicholson and Diane Dodds. And then somebody again made the mistake of giving a microphone to showcase the breath mission at Europe, and somehow I got on to talking about whiskies. I don't know how that happened. I'm coming to an end, you'll be glad to know. Our success has all been trumpeted. Our prizes, our awards, reflect that success and get us wider public dissemination and engagement. And you can see that level extends at pupil level, at student level, and at collective program level. That's an impressive trophy cabinet, I think. So hopefully you agree with me, the engagement box has been ticked. Quickly, very quickly, off duty, Keith found a model or statue of himself in European Parliament. It does have a passing resemblance to Keith, I think you'll agree. I'm doing my best to trumpet success as usual. Meanwhile, Lorraine, what is she doing? Establishing collaboration with the local scientific talent. We had so many PhDs, I was asked at one point, do PhDs grow on trees for you guys? And the answer is, yes, actually they kind of do. Thanks to the funders and our ability to realize the ambition of 15, 16 PhD students. Breath, the next generation. Teamwork is a really important part of everything that we do. It's allowed us to effectively deal with things like pandemic. There's been one area or issue of contention, and it's been on the rugby field. Scotland won the first year, but Ireland won this year. And not only did Ireland win, they won against Scotland, England, and Ireland, and therefore are the Triple Crown. So well done. I would wear this, but we're short of time. Moving on. I'll put it on in a moment. So congratulations, Ireland, just to show you the true spirit of teamwork. Where are our PhD students now? Off to new horizons as quality trained scientists, exactly what we planned. We've had a great time, the Scottish contingent visiting Ireland and Northern Ireland. We're so disappointed the pandemic got in the road of you all coming to visit Scotland. So, Fata Gu Araba, that's for Stephen's benefit. You're welcome to Scotland anytime. It's a beautiful country. And there I'll conclude. Thank you.